Okay, here we are. Welcome to the American Prospects Weekly Roundup. Um, I am Ryan Cooper, the managing editor of the American Prospect for the next 2 weeks. David, unfortunately, is off gallivanting in Europe, so you're stuck with us. The inmates are running the asylum. I have with me today two of our writing fellows. We've got Emma Jansen and James Barada. So thanks for joining me on short notice. Um, as usual, when David is gone, I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off, and so we had to prep for this at the last second. However, I think we got some good stuff lined up for today, and I thought we could talk about first the Republican mega bill and a couple of things that are in that. So, the Republicans, they're trying to get their big package of legislation through. As usual for Republicans, it is principally a bunch of huge tax cuts for rich people. That's what they did under Trump's first term. That was the only basically serious piece of legislation they got through. That's what they did during George W. Bush's first term, two big packages of tax cuts. Um, and so I thought we could talk about first food stamps. And Emma, you have a piece for us this week about the changes to the food stamp program or supplemental nutrition assistance for whatever it stands for. Anyway, yeah, could you talk about that for a bit?
Yes, I can for sure. Also, just a heads up, my cat is going crazy in the background. So if you hear what sounds like a siren, it's my cat. But he is also interested in this stuff. So basically, SNAP is administered by the USDA, which means that it's under the purview of the Agriculture Committee, who met to do their markups of this mega bill on Tuesday evening. And going into this, we knew that it was going to be pretty bad for SNAP. And I had written a long article kind of breaking down every single possible cut or negative alteration to the program that Republicans were considering. And the big kind of 60,000-foot view of this was that Republicans were told to find $230 billion in cuts through the Ag Committee, which would almost certainly majority come out of SNAP because SNAP is a fairly expensive program and a major part of that committee's purview. And so going into it, we knew that there would be kind of a devastating amount of money that would leave the 42 million Americans who receive money from SNAP really vulnerable. But what ended up happening on Tuesday was actually even worse than we had imagined. There's the cat, aforementioned cat. So Republicans instead decided to cut 300 billion. So that's 70 million more than they said they were going to cut. And part of the way that they're finding that much money is by making significant alterations to the program. So, for example, I think one really major difference is that they are requiring some states now to pay into the money that actually gives the direct food benefits. So usually the states are only on the hook for about half of the administrative cost of SNAP, and they aren't on the hook at all for the cost of the food benefits. That's really supposed to be the federal government's job. But now they're changing that, and it's going to probably hit rural, often Republican governed states the hardest. They're now going to have to find millions upon millions of dollars, depending on the state. The number changes, but that they otherwise would never have had to spend to help get their citizens food. And that will, for some states, just potentially be impossible to get done because, a lot of these rural states don't have large tax bases. They are already funding other social safety net programs, and there's just not room in the budget to add millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to fund SNAP. So this could end up being incredibly devastating and also very politically devastating for Republicans in those states. So we're seeing some conflict within their party over that. But it's just, you know, we are also seeing really devastating things with Medicaid as well, and it's just part and parcel of the same destruction of social safety net benefits, whether it's through direct funding cuts or just eroding the program, making it more difficult to access with work requirements and things like that. So that's the SNAP news. It's unfortunately worse than we thought it was going to be.
One quick follow-up on that.
Yeah.
SNAP isn't just a kind of a goofy designed welfare payment system, where you get this voucher that you can only spend on certain types of food, which creates a ton of administrative overhead that you could avoid completely if you just gave people money, which
Mhm.
is what it ends up being anyways, because, almost nobody has no money, and so they just shift their spending around. Anyway, that aside, it does help people who, don't have enough money to feed themselves. But what it also does is it's a big subsidy to farmers and retailers like Walmart, other grocery stores where this money is spent and where they buy the food that's produced by farmers in places like Iowa, governed by Republicans. And so are you seeing any sort of, organized lobbying pushback to preserve that benefit for, corporate America?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, and it's something I kind of want to look into a little more. I've been focusing more on the side of talking to SNAP advocates and food bank administrators and people who use SNAP, but you're completely right that SNAP is incredibly entangled with like national grocers, whether it is massive grocers like Walmart or even just like small mom and pop grocers in rural areas where they might be the only folks serving an entire town or even county. And like you said, it's also really beneficial for farmers as well. So that's something I want to look more into and maybe see if we're getting any meaningful lobbying pushes from them and see if Republicans would actually be receptive to that. And you'd kind of expect them to be because, right, there's all this talk about helping American farmers and making sure that our farms are strong, but this is a really major way that farms get revenue and um, it would be devastating. I think I've used that word too many times, but it's really hard to express just how interlinked grocers, farmers, lower income Americans who receive SNAP. It's such an food banks. This system is incredibly interlocked, and when one part of it, such as SNAP, becomes underfunded or defunded, it just the ramifications are very immediate to those other parts of the system. And then as those other parts of the system start to break down, so as mom and pop grocers suddenly see like a reduction by half of their usual spending because all of their customers lost their food money, they go out of business. And then that makes food deserts worse and that makes food access harder. So that puts more strain on the food banks. But the food banks rely on getting a lot of their food from local farmers. But then the local farmers are also struggling. Like it's just the more you think about it, the more you can come up with those like domino effect cycles. And yeah, it's pretty scary.
Yeah, I guess if you're looking for a big pot of money to savage so that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos can get richer, where better to start than by literally snatching food out of the mouths of hungry families.
Yeah.
And to that point, this raises another question, which is Medicaid. That's another great big pot of money that mostly goes to help the worst off people in society. Medicaid, of course, is the Great Society Johnson era counterpart to Medicare, which is mainly available for people who are very poor and or have, children. I think Medicaid covers about 47% of all the births in the country. Um, and also, very low income seniors. There are a lot of so-called dual eligibles, people who are on Medicare, but they're also have so little money they're eligible for Medicaid as well. And so Medicaid is um, one of the biggest funders of nursing home services in the country, as well as I believe the single biggest insurer in the country of any kind, bigger than Medicare and obviously a lot bigger than a private insurer. So, James, you've been writing about the Medicaid portion of this bill. Can you get into that?
Certainly. So that piece is on its way, really just hammering out a lot of the details around what ended up, going through the approval process on Wednesday. The Medicaid is under the purview of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. They had their markup session beginning on Tuesday, lasted for over 26 hours through the night. And that was sort of what we had been seeing just in general with a lot of these committees this week. Just really trying to, on the Republican side, fighting off, really over at what ended up being hundreds of, over 100 amendments to that, all sort of aimed at preventing sort of the worst of these cuts. So essentially, there are a number of provisions in that bill that the Prospect has also previously reported on. Basically, what we are seeing here is that the really the most notable provision that is within the bill is seeking to impose a cost sharing requirement for those who are at or hovering above the federal poverty line. So just for background, for individuals, federal poverty line is around 15,000 of your earnings overall, and then for families that goes up to 26,000. So for those families and individuals who are receiving Medicaid benefits, basically the result of this provision would force them to pay significantly higher out-of-pocket costs to just have coverage. There's an exemption for children under 18 and for pregnancy care, but there's sort of a myriad list of different changes that are included in this that are really going to be impactful and felt by really the most vulnerable Americans. And in the sort of addition to that, you have proposed reductions to the Affordable Care Act, basically premiums that have been used for different families to access, health care. Basically, that would the provision would be to remove those so that savings can be generated basically by ripping health insurance out of the hands of people who need it most. And in doing that, there's also changes to eligibility and enrollment rules, which, as Ryan was speaking about, dual eligibles for Medicare and Medicaid. And the sort of effect of that would just be making it much harder to access Medicaid in general, and just, really making it harder to, get the care that you need. So yeah, there's a whole list of different things, especially specifically changes to the way that states are able to secure additional Medicaid funding. That is sort of has been an ongoing issue for some time now, but the sort of point of that is to reduce the ability of the states to get federal funding for these programs. So yeah, I mean, all in all, I've, in watching the very, very long session the other day, really became clear to many and many in the in the audience, or who were not also necessarily in Congress, who were just attending, that this is really going to be devastating for so many people. It was described as cruel, and at the end of the day, I think, there's definitely a lot of, challenges ahead for, getting this over the finish line on the Republican side. A lot of challenges both from hardline Republicans as well as more moderate Republicans who have really sought to really set limits on, okay, do we really need to cut this much to the extent that it's going to be so devastating? Is there, less cuts that we can make that would still achieve the goal that they have? So, yeah, definitely is something that is I've been following very closely, and we will have really in-depth coverage of that coming up.
We have a question in the chat from Fireblade 143. Could a Democratic president and Congress reverse tax cuts? Absolutely, yes, they could. This is regular legislation. Yeah, all you need is um, through the reconciliation process to get around the filibuster. You can do tax cuts that way. Anything having to do with the budget, basically. Or you could get rid of the filibuster with a majority vote in the Senate. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, that could be done. Another question from Steve Kane. Where can we find SNAP spending per state and county? I do not know that offhand. Maybe
I
Emma
got you.
does?
I do, yeah. I would really recommend actually the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. They are a kind of like advocacy organization that keeps really immaculate data on SNAP and other safety net programs as well, but I use them primarily to get some SNAP info. And I would also recommend the FRAC, the Food Research Action Center. They keep really good data as well. You can find a lot of these data through the USDA itself, but I would recommend those kind of other organizations because they parse the data and make really beautiful graphs and that are just extremely readable and understandable. And then the CBPP, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, also does a state-by-state breakdown, and you can find out, how many people are on SNAP and how much each dollar of SNAP generates for the local economy, because SNAP actually does, when you have people spending money in the local economy off of SNAP dollars, that stimulates the economy. So you can find a lot of really great stuff from them.
Yeah, yeah. I would bet that they're getting most of their data from USDA and other government agencies, but
Exactly.
aside from the St. Louis Fed, the government is pretty bad about making its data available in a really nice, pleasing way.
Is the St.
Um,
Why are they good? The St. Louis Fed? I don't know this.
oh yeah, for the Fred tool. If viewers haven't ever checked it out, yeah, just go Saint I forget the address of it, but yeah, it's known as Fred, but it's set up by the St. Louis Fed, and
That's
it's got a really handy data tool for all kinds of data. Not just American either. It's got all kinds of European stuff in there.
oh,
European Union is maybe even worse than the U.S. about
oh
having
no.
legible government data. But yeah, very handy stuff. And you can add different, make your custom charts and, like divide one data set by another, all types of stuff. Anyway, little plug for apparently if you go there, you can buy a t-shirt and all the biggest nerds in the country, they go and they buy
Oh,
t-shirts
I'm
at St.
sure.
Louis. Um, oh, one last follow-up on Medicaid. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but they've been talking about adding work requirements
I
to
was gonna mention this.
Yes,
is
so
that
that's a huge part of all this. So, basically, imposing work requirements on this program would make people who would otherwise be eligible for it ineligible for it. And basically, with the argument against that, that we'd seen sort of playing out the other day, was that basically, it's sort of looking at it from the other way. It's sort of flipping the paradigm on its head. You for somebody who wants to work and is unable to due to health issues, if they can't get the health care they need, it's most likely going to prevent their ability from addressing the issues that they have, so that they can work. And sort of the reverse argument from the Republican side has been that if you're not even working, like, you're not deserving of these, basic things that, you need to survive. So that's really going to be devastating, just for so many people. And really, in general, with the work requirements and all the other changes to enrollment eligibility, the risk from the estimates from the Congressional Budget Office are estimating that, you're going to have over 10 million people who are not going to be able to access Medicaid. And then on top of that, you are probably going to have around, they said, between 7.6 and 8.6 million people who will just not have insurance, health insurance. So, I mean, the implications of this are extremely far-reaching, and it really does go part and parcel with what's happening with SNAP right now as well. It's just this giant chainsaw being taken to the social safety net.
Yeah, I was also going to add briefly that Snap already does have some work requirements, but those are going to be expanded likely. That's what the part of the plan to find that 300 billion did, is they are planning to expand work requirements. And I believe that, I think it was the CBPP who I mentioned earlier, did some crunching of the numbers and found that likely that could end up um, removing eligibility for 1 in 4 SNAP recipients, which is just a massive percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, we even have data on this. Arkansas, I believe, 7 years ago, they tried adding work requirements to Medicaid, and there was no effect at all on unemployment. And Georgia tried a different strategy where they made a bunch more people theoretically eligible for Medicaid if they could jump through the work requirements hoops that they set up. And the result was as the Washington Post reported today, out of 250,000 newly eligible people, just 12,000 of them managed to actually enroll in the program. And they ended up spending more on administration than they did on benefits for the new enrollees. Medicaid is already a huge pain in the ass to get enrolled in, and this, just adding these paperwork burdens just makes it more difficult for everyone to access care, even if you do have a job. And I think that tends to demonstrate that the actual intention here is to just like forcibly kick people off through bureaucracy and paperwork headaches to free up more budgetary headroom for the rich. To your one last, just to emphasize to your point, James, um, that this doesn't even make sense on the sort of like welfare queen grounds. The idea Reagan, is always talking about, oh, there's all these poor black people who are just living high on the hog on their welfare benefits, and so we need to crack down. But that's like classic welfare and SNAP. That's at least something you can, food you can live on. You can't live on health insurance. You can't eat Medicaid. So there's already a huge incentive to go out and get a job if you possibly can. So yeah, it's just complete gratuitous cruelty for its own sake. Um, let's see, one last point on the mega bill. Emma, you mentioned there may be a brewing conflict over the so-called SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction that was a part of the original Trump tax cuts back in 2017, and is a bone of contention among Republicans today. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, so I will admit that this is not something that I followed terribly well when it first came out, like you mentioned, in the first Trump tax cuts. But I've been reading some reporting this week as we've seen Republicans just working to pass this mega bill. And so it seems like there's kind of this split emerging among Republicans where um, some Republicans that represent wealthier constituencies are big fans of this SALT thing because it essentially allows folks that are paying higher amounts in taxes. And Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, or James, if I'm getting any of these things wrong. But my understanding is that um, it allows folks who are paying a decent amount of money in taxes to get some like credit or reduction based off of their state and local taxes. They can then take that to their federal taxes, and it
Yeah, here,
less
I
taxes.
Yeah, the way it worked, well, yeah, let's see. Maybe James can correct me too. But
Yeah.
the way it used to work is you could write off your state and local taxes on your federal taxes to reduce your federal tax burden. In the Trump tax cuts, they actually capped that deduction at
Mhm.
$10,000.
Yeah.
And so that was like basically a way to get a pay for it in the bill by specifically punishing wealthy blue state liberals in New York and California, Connecticut, other states because that's the places that really benefit from that because in those states they have very high taxes and a lot of wealthy people who can write them off. And so in places like Long Island, that are currently represented by Republicans, but in very narrow races, they really want to get rid of that cap to give basically a tax cut to their most mobilized constituents. There's not that many people who actually benefit from this, but it's the type of people who donate to, political campaigns and so on. But anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, please, that's extremely helpful. And so there's just this infighting in the Republican Party over this. And I think I even read somewhere that someone was suggesting changing it to a 30,000 cap, which is just kind of probably not at all politically viable. And that could end up being one of the issues that the speaker is going to have to work around and kind of appease some people on because there were all these. This actually goes into sort of this larger thing that I think involves both SNAP and Medicaid as well, which is that going into this mega bill writing and marking up process, there were so many different promises that were kind of made either very formally or informally from Speaker Johnson to his constituents or just from Republican leadership in general, to other members of the caucus. And, for SNAP and Medicaid, for example, some of these promises were like, don't worry, Republicans who represent really poor, often Hispanic districts, like we're not going to completely slash the programs that your constituents rely on. You'll be fine. You'll get reelected, and then clearly that's not happening. Um, you know, the bill last I saw is going to cost like $500 million more than it was projected to cost. And so that raises the question of, are we actually going to see like tax hikes? And so those are some broken promises within the Republican caucus. And so I think to me, how I'm reading the SALT issue is there's just more kind of infighting and more negotiating that's going to happen on behalf of Speaker Johnson and other Republican leadership. So I guess we'll see if they're able to pull it off. But it's messy. It's not without its issues.
Yeah, it's kind of downstream of a problem that Democrats have also faced, which is that, the Republican, or sorry, the constitutional architecture is so clunky. And when you combine that with the Senate filibuster and the way that the Senate filibuster works, which is that one Senate staffer sends one email, and that's 60 vote requirement for any normal legislation, very easy to do. It's not like in the movies where you have to have, some guy standing on the floor talking indefinitely. Um, that, they end up pushing everything through these reconciliation packages, which can only be done, typically once a year. And so
Yeah.
they just jam everything into that and
Yep.
try to ram it through rather than doing like regular order budgeting, which just doesn't happen anymore, where you're just like, okay, we're going to do defense, and now we're going to do immigration, and now we're going to do budget, and like the welfare state spending, tax collection, and all that type of stuff. You could break these things out, but because you can't pass normal legislation ever, for the most part, with only very rare exceptions, yeah, you end up with this just trying to ram through a gigantic, unwieldy
Yeah.
um, bill that makes everyone mad in some ways, and they have a very small margin for error. And what happened with Democrats during Biden's term was that they lost like, a good half of it just went down the toilet. All the welfare state parts of Build Back Better basically just didn't happen because Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema didn't want them. Um, yeah, let's see. Let's move on to a different topic. James, so you wrote this week about habeas corpus and the Magna Carta, and the administration's legal arguments that they are could be justified in suspending that right, which is the only one I believe mentioned in the original text of the Constitution and not the Bill of Rights. So can you talk about that?
Absolutely. The focus of that piece is on habeas corpus, which is basically, your ability to challenge, the legality of your detention if you are detained, in certain circumstances, right? So, we've seen specifically the use of this emerging more in cases that are challenging the illegality of detentions of people who have been outspoken against the government, specifically with regard to the Palestinian rights movement. Basically what's happening there is, as this sort of legal remedy has been used for people who were already in prison who are challenging, their detention for other reasons. It's sort of now really becoming, clear that, as there's all these different cases that are invoking habeas corpus to uh, really be as a defense against, legality of detention. That is sort of a shifting sort of use of it that we're seeing now. And in the writ of habeas corpus itself, it dates back to, the even like before the Magna Carta, like the Middle Ages. So, That was in one of the many clauses of the Magna Carta that were signed in 1215, the year 1215, in the Middle Ages, and has since really become a core tenet of the Constitution, and really kind of underscores, just the general not being able to get thrown in prison for arbitrary reasons, such as being in opposition to the government, or things related to that. So the cases that have been ongoing basically are showing this sort of legal drama unfold in terms of the use of it being applied to the sort of more emerging piece, which is to protect to as a defense against arbitrary detention based on different sort of circumstances. So the first sort of main bit that we're seeing is on the sort of supposed invasion that is happening at the southern border, and basically a formal invasion is defined as a prolonged, legal, forcible predatory incursion by a foreign government. One of the sort of issues that I was writing about was focusing on the detainees of suspected Tren de Aragua Venezuelan gang members in Aurora, Colorado. Basically, that most of those people, I think, were not actually, the evidence that would come in due process and be determined as, saying, okay, this person is involved in certain activities. Um, did not that opportunity wasn't even given because due process initially was denied in that situation, and people were being held in that case based on you know the argument of law enforcement and them not actually having to prove anything at the time. So there's been a lot of legal pushback against the Trump administration's plans to suspend habeas corpus, which is something that it has been considering based on, comments from Deputy Chief of Staff, the White House, Stephen Miller. Those comments definitely, coming casually on a Friday afternoon, were definitely something that really just, in a sense, broke the internet because, the President of the United States cannot unilaterally suspend habeas corpus. And for it to even be suspended, Congress has to basically pass a measure that would allow and grant the president and just grant the order to do so. And that has to be done either during extraordinary circumstances where the courts may not be able to function. So, you know, it's happened 4 times since the ratification of the Constitution. And although the first time when President Abraham Lincoln had unilaterally suspended it, it was later, approved, not approved, but Congress had passed a measure doing that in 1863, which is 2 years after the initial decision. And there was a Supreme Court case where it was argued that, the president they cannot do this. Um, but, that was ultimately ignored at the time by President Abraham Lincoln before ultimately Congress had done that. So basically, there's this invocation of the Alien Enemies Act as well, and just different laws from dating back many 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 years, basically saying that there's an ongoing invasion and an insurrection and domestic incursion happening where Trump's legal team is basically saying we want to we don't think that um, you know pe people who are currently detained would need to have this due process, this basic thing, because there's such extraordinary circumstances, which as federal courts have been proving time and time and again earlier this month that basically dispelling that argument and saying that there is no actual invasion or rebellion contrary to what is being suggested. So it's
Yeah.
been really interesting, really interesting thing to follow because it's such a centerpiece of liberal democratic values and the way that governance and is carried out, and with the way the judiciary is tasked with upholding the rule of law.
Yeah, I think it is instructive to compare, the Lincoln action, which was, unilateral executive authority, to what's going on now, because like this in this case, this was ex parte Merriman. That was the case where basically the Maryland, like Confederate sympathizers, were blowing up bridges in Maryland to isolate Washington, D.C., which would have prevented Congress from even being able to convene and rule one way or the other on anything. And so Lincoln ordered one of these guys thrown in jail without due process. And like that's the type of extreme circumstance, as Lincoln argued, that you could actually justify. It's like, okay, we don't have time for this. We'll get to it later, which he did, to his credit. It was like, okay, once we can, we're gonna actually do this the proper way through the legislature. Whereas now, they claim this Tren de Aragua thing is tantamount to an invasion, but like not only are the people that they're throwing into El Salvador Gulag not affiliated with um, Tren de Aragua for the most part. Like three-quarters of them do not have any discernible criminal record whatsoever. Uh, as far as I can tell, Tren de Aragua doesn't even really operate in the United States. This is entirely a media fiction. And even if it did, foreign criminal gang operating in this country is not an invasion. That's something that's been happening basically continuously since the 19th century.
Yeah.
Italian mafia, various Eastern European, Russian affiliated gangs and stuff. That this is a minor thing. It's not like a full-blown, war, foreign troops marching in regular order. Um,
I know our colleague Maureen just wrote a week or two ago a really great investigation into Tren de Agua, and just like dove into that like false media narrative and things like that. So I would really recommend that piece if people want to know more about it.
yeah, a slumlord in Colorado uh, took like an actual, like a serious crime, or like a bunch of criminals who had like broken into people's homes and hired a PR firm to whip that up into like this massive foreign excursion. And it's like it's one of those things where yeah, it was a serious like bad thing that happened, but it's just a crime. Crimes happen.
Hmm.
It's not a invasion.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, let's see. We got a little bit of time left. Let's talk for a minute about this 747 Trump got from Qatar.
Yeah.
Um, as a little bit of background, from what I can tell, reading about why he wanted this airplane, it was that he was going to foreign countries and seeing other delegations get off on their planes, and their planes were a little bit bigger than Air Force One, which doesn't really make sense to me because the 747 is about the biggest type of plane that anybody uses. But I guess that's it. It is definitely a lot more luxurious than the current Air Force One. It's got all kind of, it was like kitted out by this French company, and it's got all these, cream leather seats and silk and stuff, and, gold panels and whatnot. Um, but the interesting thing that I learned reading an article in Forbes is that the Qataris have been trying to get rid of this plane for 5 years now. They put it up for sale in 2020. Nobody would buy it because it's basically a white elephant. These types of planes, they're incredibly expensive to run. Back in 2019, it cost $23,000 an hour to run this sucker. And so you'd have to imagine it's quite a bit more than that now with inflation. Then you have massive maintenance expenses that happen every 6 to 12 years. It's due for one of those in 2027. You have to take the entire plane apart and recertify everything.
Mm.
Huge pain in the neck. And governments around the world have been moving towards more smaller, more efficient airplanes that are much cheaper and easier to operate. And especially since the 747 has been discontinued for many years now, there's a shrinking pool of staff who actually know how to work on the thing, which only makes it even more expensive. Um, and yeah, even more than that, it would take, you get this plane and it is not up to scratch as far as US standards. It would take years to retrofit. Apparently, you got to sweep it for foreign bugs, which you'd have to assume would be present from every country in the world. Just get your bugs in, folks.
Yeah, well, you
Um,
can.
and then it has to be armored against the EMP from nuclear explosions. That's the requirement that it has.
And probably like anti-missile like
Oh yeah, yeah.
tech. Yeah.
It's a huge part of the thing. And yeah, an unbelievable, wasteful, expensive piece of junk.
Yeah.
But any thoughts about Emma, what do you think that this represents about, the Trump regime?
Yeah. I mean, okay. So my first kind of thought is to your point, Ryan, about the fact that this is just like a bigger, more luxurious gold, trim kind of jet. I like it's just my first thought is like this is classic Trump silliness that I think we need to be better as, you know, folks on the left or to the left of Trump at just letting kind of slide off our backs and not focusing on. But I do think that it is more important than that. And I think that it shows how the world has learned how to deal with Trump and how world leaders and different governments are learning his MO, and they've had enough time to kind of think about it during Trump 1 and during the 4 years in between. And they know that he likes big, glitzy things. And now we're seeing, some world leaders know how he negotiates. Like, I think Canada and Mexico have a pretty good sense at how he likes to bluff and say some, promise kind of a ridiculous crackdown, and then he will settle for something way smaller and call it a victory. So I think to me, this jet coming from Qatar, who is not really our super friend, Trump has talked about the fact that they are, entangled with Hamas and like, um, I think it just represents that larger shift in how people deal with Trump and this better understanding, both from within US politics and external governments. And so I think we have to be wary of the fact that maybe Trump is susceptible to these outside actors understanding how he works and be really cautious about those sorts of things and the kind of leverage that can come from that. But yeah, to me, that's how I'm reading it. It's just like, wow, the world really knows how to just play him a little bit.
Yeah. Perhaps worth mentioning that, Trump basically characterizes this as a gift to himself. And if I
Yeah,
recall correctly, he's also said that the plane after his term will go to his presidential library.
library, yeah.
And that
Which
the
is, sorry, continue, Ryan. You're good.
oh, just the Constitution says that you can't do that. The president cannot accept any gifts of any kind from a foreign government, period. Just categorical prohibition. And it's just, no, they, not
It's
doing it.
very odd the way that they're kind of trying to get around that is they're saying like, oh no, it'll be kind of a direct donation to the Department of Defense, which, the theory is that that kind of gets around what you were saying, Ryan. But then, yeah, then Trump is saying, no, it'll go to my library. And he's almost saying that. I've heard that being kind of repeated in the context of like, don't worry, it's not actually that bad. It'll just be at his library for people to look at it. So he won't be flying on it, afterwards. But if it's a donation to the DoD or goes through the DoD, that doesn't really add up to me at all that it would then end up at his library. So it's just a very weird, like, piecemeal way of making it seem less corrupt than it is.
So if
Any
I might
thoughts,
add,
yours? Go ahead.
in the event that it does not end up in the library and it does, stays within the State Department and is continued to be used, as you were saying, Ryan, like the expense around that definitely exceeding what would really be what is already being paid for to operate Air Force One. And it's sort of just thinking about all the sort of cuts to the social safety net that are making their way through Congress, or going to go to the House floor and go through that whole process. It's sort of like that like taxpayers are going to be paying for this very luxurious, really it's paying for a luxurious private jet for whoever's in office, if it is just passed on and not put into the library. Meanwhile, people are not going to be able to, are really going to be going hungry and without insurance. And just sort of the parallel between that couldn't be more stark.
Yeah, it is wild. They're talking about, again, literally snatching food out of the mouths of hungry children. And meanwhile, the US government is spending tens of millions of dollars a month on Trump's golf trips, taking the whole kit and caboodle, all Air Force One and Secret Service and all the fighter jet escorts and everything down to Mar-a-Lago basically every weekend so that Trump can play golf. And just the wretched gushing excess of it is just so disgusting. I mean, that's not that much compared to, 300 odd billion dollars in cuts to various social programs, to food stamps, and then another many hundred billions to Medicaid. But yeah, it is re emblematic of a just absolutely corrupt government being run by and for a tiny clique of rich people who are all picking our pockets. Um, let's see. We have this Supreme Court case coming up. James, have you been paying attention to that?
Yeah, so what's interesting about the case, there was a top legal official was recently speaking on a podcast. I forget which one, but basically was just saying that where the case is playing out, what's interesting about it is that all of a sudden, if somebody has, citizenship, right, per se, of the United States of, a certain place, and they go to another state, if what the argument is, if that does happen, that person, would be stateless in another situation. And what the sort of underlying, sort of, outcome of, saying that birthright citizenship, should be sort of on like something that is determined as opposed to something that you just have. I think the interesting part about that is like what the risk here really is creating a new really generation of stateless individuals who are born here, but would not be assigned, would not have a in that case, as it is determined, could not possibly have an actual be a citizen of an actual nation. And for families who are of mixed status, the challenges there for them are extraordinary. It's definitely for this to even be a question that is being sort of determined in the courts is really remarkable.
Yeah, it is again. I mean, they've been talking about this for a long time, getting rid of birthright citizenship, and it just shows you the degree to which, like, the Constitution is de facto suspended. That it says the Constitution says, 14th Amendment, first sentence, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Like, that is very clear language, especially by the standards of the Constitution, which is quite vague at times. Um, and you can even go back to the debates, do some textualism, some original intent. What did the framers of the Constitution mean when they were writing this sucker up? Because it wasn't just James Madison. There was also the people that wrote the 14th Amendment, like John Bingham, I believe he wrote that section. And they had debates about like, whoa, this means that any immigrants come in and they have children, then they're going to be citizens. And they're like, yep, that's what it means. We're going to do that. That is the thing we are doing right now. And it's just, you're dealing with people who are so totally dishonest that they'll just look you right in the eye and say black is white. And that's the way it is. And that probably has four votes at least on Supreme Court. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Um, our last few minutes, let's see. Emma, you said you had a transit article you're working on. So what's that all about?
I can give a little quick preview. So our colleague Gabrielle, who has done a ton of reporting on how different cities throughout the US are, and different states and metro areas, et cetera, are dealing with this kind of funding cliff that is hitting a lot of states roughly in this time period where they got a lot of COVID money from the federal government to keep their transit systems running and to just make sure things would be okay through COVID. And a lot of that money is running out or has already run out for some transit systems in some states, and some states are expecting it to run out in 2026, et cetera. So, for just a little preview for everyone, I live in Chicago. I don't own a car. I ride Chicago Transit every single day pretty much. And um, we here are looking at a really big, like $770 million cliff coming up with Chicago and the regional transit system around here that could lead, if they don't get that funding, to like 1 in 5 folks in this region not having transit access functionally, or having just basically like so little and so rare transit access that it's functionally non-existent. Um, so I'm writing about that and looking at, how different states have approached getting money for transit. We obviously have, I think a lot of people followed the kind of congestion pricing back and forth that New York was doing, and different states are thinking of different kind of like tax incentives. I know New Jersey came up with kind of like a surtax that helped fund its transit. So I'm going to be taking a look at what's happening here in Illinois and putting it into that larger context of like, what are the best approaches? And I also ideally will look at, the bigger picture, which is why is it that our transit systems are almost like set up to fail in so many different states? Why is it that every few years, or at least every few decades, we have to kind of ring these alarm bells where it's a do or die situation? And wouldn't it be better if we could come up with some more sustainable funding sources, some more sustainable policies that would actually make our transit better, not just allow it to survive? So, kind of looking into that. Transit fans, keep an eye out. I feel like we got a lot of like transit nerds who read the prospect. So, this one's for you guys.
A lot of this is downstream of work from home, right? I mean, like
Yeah,
the
totally.
pan the pandemic, kind of established a new normal where, I mean, depending on the region, what something like, 20 to like 50% of workers are not commuting anymore. They're working from home.
Yep.
And so that is like just devastated the business model of transit, which was centered around, um, I think not only just transit actually, because it was
Yeah,
like the whole idea was you build these commuter systems that are designed to transmit people, to take people from wherever they live in the city or outside of the city into the central business district where they work for companies, and the companies pay a lot of money in tax revenue. And with work from home, that's changed the dynamics of how people want to use transit. And it's also seriously dented the profitability of those office spaces.
exactly.
And so they're looking at a double whammy of hitting the city budgets that depend on property taxes, commercial property taxes pretty hard,
Yeah.
and also these massive service cuts you've been talking about. But I mean, are you seeing like promising? I mean, it seems like New York has a decent strategy working
Yeah.
out. But other cities, trying to rejigger their transit networks to try to like cater to how people would prefer to use it. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's complicated. I think so here in Illinois, the folks who are kind of in charge of this push, it's the RTA, Regional Transit Authority. And the RTA has like 11 different policy proposals for, how can we get transit funding? And one of them is like implement congestion pricing. There's a bunch of different like kind of tax-based revenue um, systems. But I think what I've had some conversations with folks about is the kind of like if you build it, they will come theory of transit, which is like a lot of the reasons, obviously, there's this massive work from home component, but in cities like Chicago, you know, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I can tell you just anecdotally that transit is still a very significant part of Chicago life. And like you also get a lot of working class folks riding transit because it's really affordable here compared to cities like San Francisco, for example. Uh, and, a lot of those jobs are still in person. And so transit is still, you know, we still have a very well used transit system here in Chicago, but what we're seeing is that the fact that you sometimes have to wait 27 minutes in the cold for a bus is a major deterrent for people to using transit. And if we can actually figure out sustainable funding models instead of, like I said, these like do or die things where we get just enough to push it to, someone else's issue in 10 years, if we actually have consistent funding, we can get wait times down to like what you might see in New York City, where it's like 5 minutes between things. And so if you miss your train, that's totally fine. You just wait 5 more minutes. And that then also eliminates the need for these different operators. Here in Chicago, we have three. We have Pace, Metra, and CTA. That eliminates the need for a lot of administrative, like timing work. These operators, when things come every 20 to 30 minutes, they have to really plan like, okay, will a Metra be there in time for everyone getting off the CTA? Because otherwise there's like a 30-minute gap and then there's an hour and then so I think the what a lot of people in the transit world are thinking about right now is like one of the biggest determinant of whether or not people use transit is just like, is it there? Is it reliable? Is it often? And so that's something I'm hearing alongside all of this budget crisis talk is just like, if we want transit to work in a new world, like a post-pandemic world, it needs to just be like constant and it needs to be reliable. Um, and it is not, I can tell you that for sure, unfortunately, not here.
Alas, yeah.
Us.
Yeah, I mean, it is a unfortunate, the fact that people can't see even a city like Chicago, like it more or less would not function without a reasonably effective transit system. Like you just can't have everyone driving personal cars around in a city that dense, and that's
Oh.
doubly true of New York City. I remember after Hurricane Sandy,
Mhm.
um, the subways were flooded and it stopped for a while, and the result was just like a traffic jam from New Jersey to Connecticut. You can't move that many people around without the subway. It just can't happen. And it's like you just got to find the money somewhere. All these work from home people that like they were paying a little bit to go in to the office, and so like clearly there's like enough money to be harvested somewhere
Yeah.
in the system, and yeah, to make it more functional. Uh, let's see, we just got a couple of minutes left. James, you got anything you're in the can?
Yeah, so right after Medicaid, definitely planning to keep sort of following the Federal Railroad Administration and some renewed opposition that had come from different groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute about repealing the two-person train crew rule for freight bound rail and other sort of passenger rail that use large corridors throughout the country.
What is this?
It's
I'm so sorry to interrupt. What is the rule and why does it matter? Because I don't know anything about like rail
Yeah.
and rail. Yeah.
So what's really interesting about all this is that, for, under the Biden administration, the final rule was implemented to require two people on trains. So that would be an engineer and a conductor,
Mm.
at the very least. So um, you know, there's been sort of a lot of pushback, specifically, stemming from a request for information that was released by the Federal Railroad Administration, sort of opening up, hey, are there any regulations that, we could maybe modify or, repeal outright that would really re result in cost savings? Basically, now that we had the recent Senate confirmation hearing for the Federal Railroad Administrator David Fink, who is Trump's pick to run that. It was sort of telling when he was asked whether or not he would maintain that rule, which the reason why this rule is important is because it basically, prevents, one person from being required to basically take on the entirety of the responsibilities of if there is an issue when you are transporting something for, it could be anywhere from a few hours to, a few dozen hours, like, over a dozen hours. If there is an issue, you not having to be the only one there to have to make sure that, okay, if I have to inspect something and I need to dismount this train, um, you know, am I going to be able to, do that in a way that is not, dangerous for me, dangerous for people who are, in these communities where these major rail corridors are passing through.
Yeah.
Um, Having two people allows that process to go a lot more smoothly. In a lot of these places where freight rail is going. I
Yeah.
mean, when you think about how big the United States is, there are many, many remote parts in deserts, in Pacific Northwest, and even in parts of the Northeast where something happens and you're there alone, and you can't get through to first responders or even if you can, they can't reach you at a in a timely manner. It's really life and death, and that's sort of the understanding that I've walked away from talking with different rail unions about this. And the other really important part about this whole rule is. You've had a lot of carriers, so the people who are, the companies that are having their freight on the railroads who are running it. There's been a lot of issues in on their end, basically cutting, security, payroll, so like laying off security. That has resulted in, I mean, when you think about how long some of these rail, the trains are, they can be miles long in some cases.
Mhm.
So, everyone's like, well, oh my God, why are there all these thefts? But it's like, you just laid off all your security stuff. So there's a lot there. But I think really what it comes down to is, the unions themselves really have just been relying on their people and building power amongst themselves to, make sure that, safety measures are being advanced and protected. Because in the legislator, on the side of the federal government, they felt kind of that like, there hasn't been sufficient progress to actually make sure that you don't have one person running a class one train, which is the bigger ones that have
Mhm.
at least 250 million in assets on that whole train, and being able to address those situations. So it's definitely really contentious issue. Been really sort of working that and building that, and really looking forward to just unpacking sort of where the flaws in the existing rule are and the responses to that. So yeah, definitely something to look out for going forward.
I love that we're
All
both
right.
doing train stories. Very different, but
Yeah. 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 Prospect.org, your source for all things train. But we are out of time. Thanks everyone for watching, and thanks James and Emma for joining me. We will be back next week at 12:30 for the next edition of the Prospects Weekly Roundup. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you later.
bye. Thanks, everyone.